It's time to review the Simpsons game for the PlayStation 2. First of all, I'd like to say that this was a requested review by a friend from school that does not yet have a YouTube channel that I can name at the moment. All the same, if you're watching this, Mr. Requester, thanks. The Simpsons game was the first and really only game based on the once beloved animated series that was developed by EA when they acquired the license back in 2006, after which they've basically done nothing with it, given that they've been too busy trying to make this year's latest Call of Duty copycat and simply changing the rosters for their new sports games and nothing more. Released back in late 2007 to coincide with the DVD release of the Simpsons movie, which, by the way, is not related to this game in any way possible, the game was given generally good reviews and is considered alongside the Konami arcade game as well as 2003's Hit and Run to be the only good Simpsons games to have been made over the last 20-something years. More than 5 years later, how well does the PS2 port of this game hold up? Well, let's plop down on the couch and find out. While wandering through the streets of Springfield and doing generally his own thing, Bart finds a very unusual video game manual that fell from the heavens. How is it unusual? Well, it's the manual to this very game is what I mean. Reading through it, Bart finds out that he, Homer, Marge, and Lisa have special abilities that no one else has and can do whatever they like with them. So what do they decide to do with these new powers? Morally ambiguous things, of course! However, indulging in their semi-selfish fantasies is suddenly interrupted by an alien invasion that threatens to destroy their whole city. And because the writers can't be arsed to have other characters pick up the slack for once, it's up to the Simpsons to defeat the aliens and save Springfield before it's too late. The Simpsons game is a 3D platformer with beat-em-up elements where the goal is to get to the end of the level and conquer whatever heinous obstacle or enemy gets in the way of that. You jump and double jump with the X button, punch enemies with square, unleash a special attack by pressing circle as well as holding it to charge up the attack if your low meter is filled, and can activate switches, buttons, and generally interact with the world overall by pressing the triangle button when indicated to do so. As well as this, you can switch back and forth between the two characters given in each level by pressing any direction of the D-pad, and believe me, this will be very important given the fact that each character has a unique ability. First off, Homer can turn into a giant ball that can squish enemies and burst through certain walls. Marge has the power to nag people into becoming her minions to use for taking down or building structures and fighting enemies for her. Bart transforms into the purple prankster Bartman to glide, use his slingshot on enemies, yes, seriously, and climb on walls, and Lisa can use the hand of Buddha to commit acts of, well, Buddha. Over the course of the game, you'll also find well-worn tropes and cliches from across video gaming that will be pointed out by Comic Book Guy. Though keep in mind that you'll only find some of these by doing very particular things, so try and experiment with certain things in each level. And finally, you can find collectibles for each character in each level, though they really do nothing but unlock posters, dolls, and the like that parody some famous thing with all the humor out of a Sells Friedberg movie. Now, before I talk about what I liked and what I didn't like, I want to point out that I played the next-gen version to completion beforehand, and since this port is trying to replicate the experience of the PS360 version, I'm going to be comparing the two ports quite a bit. But if there is a problem or something praiseworthy that occurs specifically with the PS2 version, I will point it out as best as I can. And with that said, let's talk about the first problem that comes to mind with this game. The graphics are fecking ugly. Now, before you people go at me and say that it's a PS2 game, I don't care. I've seen several PS2 games made before this that have looked and held up much better in terms of visuals than this pile of eye-stabbing junk. Honestly, I'm not sure how, but the developers of this game somehow actually managed to take cell shading, the awesome graphical techniques that's given us utterly beautiful games like Okami, Jet Set Radio, The Wind Waker, and the like, and make a game where it's actually horrifying to look at. And it's not just the fact that Matt Groening's trademark art style usually tends to go straight into the uncanny valley whenever they're rendered in 3D, but it's also the fact that the graphics aren't very well done. In fact, they actually remind me an awful lot of old Hanna-Barbera cartoons. There is literally no shading or shadows whatsoever. The concept of lighting is non-existent in this universe, which I think is really odd given that you need shaders for your game to be properly cel-shaded. I don't care much for the graphics of the next-gen version either, but at least that had some bloody shading in it. The backgrounds are bland, jagged, and just plain horrible to look at. The lines and everything produced this terrifying little effect that made it genuinely painful for me to watch the graphics for more than 5 minutes at the time. And the character models have no personality to their animations other than having dead, cold eyes that stare into the very depths of your soul until you can do no more than cry rivers while cuddling your Sonic the Hedgehog plushie in the hopes that these horrid things will go away. As well as that, the gameplay itself I just found to be pretty average. It gets the job done and there's nothing spectacularly bad about it, but it's not all that fun either. The level designs are pretty lackluster, the combat takes up far more time than it should trying to defeat enemies that block for decades with incredibly weak attacks and decent attacks that you aren't able to use half the time because you can't find anything to charge at the power meter, and despite an interesting turn for the meta about halfway through, nothing really changes for the better. However, one thing that truly propels this particular PS2 port into the terrible territory is the litany of ridiculously broken attempts to try port the experience of the next-gen versions into this port. Honestly, the only reason I decided to keep playing through the game was to see how much they could cock up the next level. The levels are separated by loading screens on a regular basis. Some of the more epic set pieces are cut out for the sake of not destroying the console, and because the developers were too damn lazy to make their own cutscenes, they just poured over the cutscenes from the PS360 version. What this means is even more loading times, they aren't visually consistent with the rest of the game due to having better graphics, and they don't even have any music playing in the background, making them stand out more like obvious beta concepts than they already do. Probably the strangest case of this pouring disaster is with the generic Japanese game party level, which features a playable turn-based party of Pokemon known as Sparklemon. Now this is fine and all, but for no reason the Sparklemon battles are turned into cutscenes. In other words, when you get to these battles, you literally watch someone play these sequences. Mother of God, never before have I actually been grateful for skippable cutscenes in my entire bloody life. The biggest problem with this though is that it just means you're playing through the exact same game as the PS360 version, only worse. The level designs are exactly the same. You don't get a free-roaming Springfield whole world, which in itself is ridiculous given Hit and Run did just that, and it was produced on the same hardware only 4 years prior, and there isn't any kind of superlative compensation or whatever for getting this version instead. I think the developers just went off and did their own thing instead of trying and failing horribly to replicate the next-gen version. We could have gotten a much better, less disastrous game. I mean, I certainly wouldn't put it past these guys. They made Rogue Trooper and Sniper Elite V2 after all. But that's not the biggest problem with the game. No, the worst thing about this game is that its jokes and humor is some of the most cynical, laziest, and just plain unfunny comedies I've ever seen. And it's not just because this port is so bad that it's ruined my enjoyment of the game's humor. I found it to just be terrible anywhere else. I understand that humor is a very subjective thing and that a lot of people find this game to be quite funny, but honestly, I'm not really sure how the game's sense of humor is actually that good. Personally, I think it's just because the show's humor itself was so terrible at the time that even a pile of mutated lobster left in a fridge for over a year would have been more appealing. So some of you may be wondering why I don't think the game's all that funny. Odd thing is, for the longest time, I didn't actually figure that out until just recently. For years, I never liked the humor, but honestly, I wasn't really sure why I didn't. And then I watched this particular cutscene again about halfway through the game, and I realized just what the problem was.
Sure, the Simpsons game is great with its unique upgradable character abilities and its hilarious self-referential cutscenes. But what about when the Xbox 720 comes out or the PlayStation 4? No one will want to play as that.
Where do I begin? Firstly, I'd like to argue that anything that decides to pat itself on the back about halfway through for qualities it does not have nor deserve should frankly get its tongue removed by slugs, without any anesthetic. But as well as that, the smug, self-satisfied way with which that line was written and delivered perfectly encapsulated the reason I find this game to be relentlessly unfunny. By just referencing random gaming-related things, it's supposed to be funny, which is a load of bullcrap. If you want to make humor by referencing things, go ahead. But here's a tip. Actually understand why it's funny. You can't just reference a thing and expect that to be funny all by itself. Take the countless hilarious Simpsons-based video game posters seen in the second half of the game, for instance. Zero Life. Oh, it references a well-known video game but changes the child a little. Haha, humor. Or what about Project Shelbyville Racing? It's funny because it, changes Gotham to a town featured in the show. Okay? Most of the game's fourth wall breaking humor goes on like this without end, producing parodies even more shallow than the likes of Epic Movie and Meet the Spartans. The Japanese parody level that's just a random hodgepodge of cliches without any real specific joke other than, haha, Japan is weird. Characters repeatedly quoting movies or jokes that basically amount to, this is a reference, you idiots should laugh. And more that just felt like the writers assumed that all they had to do was just reference some things and expect that to roll in all the laughs. And given how many people thought the game was funny, that clearly worked. And for those of you that'll tell me that aforementioned scene was supposed to be self-deprecating, how the hell could I tell? So much of the game's dialogue and jokes felt so cynical, forced, lazy, and patronizingly unfunny that for all I know, Lisa could have been lying through her formerly braced teeth, or she could have been totally genuine. I have no clue anymore. Frankly, you'd think that a Simpsons game that dealt with the idea of the whole universe being a game alongside several others would have been more humorous. There's a lot of great potential, and I thought the idea of a minigame was really interesting. The jokes in the game could have been written in such a fashion that not only would seasoned gamers actually get the reference you're making, but also to those who don't get it. It could have been genuinely funny, but nope, tired, dreary references all the way, folks. You may as well watch Epic Movie for all the good reference jokes you'll get. At least that film's so terrible it's actually kind of entertaining. And to address the final point as to why I'm analyzing the jokes so much when this is a game, not a comedy, the reason is, to quote Dave Thier in regards to his controversial review for Borderlands 2, when the humor is thrown in your face more than once a second, it becomes a pretty big part of the game experience. And frankly, that's all I have to say about that. As for what I did enjoy about the game, I thought the soundtrack was actually pretty good. It's very understated and it's nowhere near as good as Hit and Run's awesome soundtrack, but for what it's worth, it's quite enjoyable. And that's all I enjoyed about the game. No, really, I'm actually quite serious on that front. I genuinely can't think of anything else I've found to be anything but terrible. In conclusion, the Simpsons game for the PlayStation 2 is a really bad game with awful graphics, average gameplay, no difference from the next-gen versions in terms of anything interesting or good, very awful attempts at trying to port the experience over, and some of the most painfully unfunny attempts at humor I've ever seen in a video game. The only thing it has going for it is some pretty good music, which means it's not totally irredeemable, but I still wouldn't recommend it. If you have to own a Simpsons game on the PlayStation 2, then get Hit and Run for crap's sake. It's much better, it's actually kind of funny, and it's not just a good licensed game, but it's a damn good video game in its own right. As for this pile of interactive comedy trash, I'm going to give it a rating of bloody awful. Really, really bad, but there are one or two things that keep it from failing completely. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm off to relax from this mess by playing good games for a while. I'm Father Doing 9000, and until we meet again, have a great day, all. Which I guarantee you'll have by avoiding this game like a Lawnmower Man sex scene. Anyway, see y'all later, and have a great day.